It's my great pleasure today to welcome as our guest the Reverend Dr. Alexia Salvatierra. I'm going to tell you a bit about her, but really the riches that I think of as being Alexia's are riches that are going to unfold in the course of the conversation. It's not just headlines of a person's degrees and accomplishments, but really, in my view, in this case particularly, the reality of who Alexia is. And I'm eager for you to get to know her. She's the assistant professor of integral mission and global transformation at Fuller's School of Intercultural Studies. She has just recently been added to our faculty, and it is a particularly great joy to welcome her into that role. She's previously served as visiting faculty at Fuller before transitioning to this new role as assistant professor. She received her MDiv from Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and her Doctor of Intercultural Studies from Fuller. She brings to her position an extensive background in areas of community activism, advocacy, immigration, and more. So it's all of that that we're going to explore. And Alexia, thank you so much for doing this. Welcome to Conversing.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure.
I think it's really important that we have a chance to get a bit of a picture of your background, because the arc of your formation in many different dimensions has obviously deeply shaped who you are and how you live and are engaged in ministry. So I'd rather not just talk about the tasks that you have done and the work that you're doing and have done, but really who you are. Give us a little bit of a background, and then I'll ask you a few questions along the way.
So people often ask me in Spanish what country I'm from. And so I say I'm from a good-sized Latin American country called Los Angeles. Which I am. I'm Angelina, they would say. And my grandparents were the generation that immigrated. So my grandparents came from Mexico and Russia, and they were from the anti-church traditions in those countries. So I was raised with no religious faith, and actually with some animosity towards religion. And then I became a Christian in the Jesus movement of the 70s.
Amazing. How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, I had a friend. So often it starts with a friend. Right?
Yes.
I had a friend who was going to a youth group, and I've always thought I should go try to find this pastor, but he was very different from my stereotype. He was very passionate and he was very real. And so I felt like I could bring to him everything that I'd grown up learning about Christianity. You know, all the horrible things the church had done, and where was God while we were suffering? You know, if there was a God, I mean, there's so much injustice and suffering, like where was he? And I felt like I could really, so we fought for about 9 months. We argued every week. I will always be so deeply grateful to this man that he met with me, Mark. Like, how did he do that? How did he set apart an hour a week to meet with this 17-year-old? You know, I mean, like, it's just such an amazing human being, 16 and then 17.
Wow.
And what really moved me in the end, you know, he gave me books to read, and I gave him books to read. So he gave me C.S. Lewis and John Stott, you know, and I gave him, I think, Alan Watts and Bertrand Russell. And, you know, anyhow, and he read them, you know, he read the books, I read the books. But it wasn't the arguments in the end that got me. It was really this vision of the God on the cross, the God who wasn't somewhere off playing golf while we were suffering, but was really suffering with us. And then whose suffering was effective, was powerful in victory, in creating power. That in the world that I grew up in, love and power were really different, really opposite, that loving people were not powerful and powerful people were not loving. And so this vision of sacrificial, redemptive love that then ends up with all the power, that I just said, wow, if that has the possibility of being true, I would give anything for that. You know, the pearl of great price. But when I became a Christian, we had a altar call every week at the church that he was pastoring. You know, he worked on the beach, doing evangelism, but he was also this assistant pastor at a Disciples of Christ church. And so they had an altar call every week. And so I would do the invitation shuffle along with everyone else. You know, am I going to go forward? Am I not? And when I went forward, I was so frightened because I I just remember that feeling of jumping off a cliff,
Mm,
because my family were so adamantly opposed. And everybody I knew, I mean, I was a young hippie, my whole friends, my whole universe were so adamantly opposed. And then the church that I became a member of was very conservative. And, I had been basically raised with the religion of my family being this profound commitment to justice. And so, and from the beginning for me in that church, when they handed us the Bible, thanks be to God, they gave us the Bible, they taught us to read it. And I kept saying, but justice is everywhere in the Bible. Look, like, why are we not preaching about it? Like, why don't we look, it's everywhere. Because of course I had those eyes. But
right.
the God who was with us in our suffering was with us so deeply. Like I remember reading much later when I became Lutheran, which is a whole other story, but Carl Bratton talking about deep in the flesh, that
Mm,
Jesus is deep in the flesh, that he's right there when we're suffering injustice, that
mm-hmm,
his death was also unjust.
mm-hmm. Wow. So putting those things together was seamless to you. It was obvious that they were intertwined right from the
Yeah.
beginning. Whereas for
Yeah.
some people in their background, they have to be brought together as though they are separate,
Right.
when for you, they really weren't.
No, but it was a schizophrenic experience anyhow, because
Yes.
in the church, nobody saw that but me. Like, what was
Yes.
wrong with me?
Yes.
What was wrong with me? And then I wouldn't have gone to college if I had not become a Christian, because I was a professional dancer. I had been heading towards being a ballet dancer all my life. And then I was dancing in musicals in Los Angeles. And I'd been actually offered a position dancing on TV on the Gold Diggers, which was like big deal. But I'd become a Christian in this conservative church, and I couldn't go on doing that. And so I went to college, and I went to college at University of California, Santa Cruz, which was really actually the next step sort of in my spiritual
Uh-huh.
life, because there were people there who understood that connection between justice and faith.
Right.
I was part of InterVarsity. It was actually it was because it was the Jesus movement. Everybody worked together. It was
Yes.
InterVarsity and Crew and Lutheran Campus Ministry and United Christian Campus Ministry. We all worked together, but there was a real sense, I think, among all of us of integral mission, right? Of a God
Mm-hmm.
who cared about everything, our lives
Mm-hmm.
as individuals, our families, our communities, the whole world. That was very much present, although not always thought through all the way, particularly around gender, but
Mm-hmm.
very present with all of us.
Right.
It was
Right.
more so.
Were there certain people during the Santa Cruz years that helped to congeal your sense of these things? Then did that season feel like it brought a kind of coherence to the things that you were seeing in a way that wasn't as supported by your church per se?
That's a really good question. Because yes, but then to think about the details, like what were the
Right.
details? I mean, that was the time when we were all learning about Cesar Chavez.
Yes.
And I don't ever remember not knowing. I mean, I knew farm workers. I was working with farm workers, and they were people of profound faith,
Right.
and I had been taught by my church to think that Catholics were not Christians, but the Catholics I met were Christians. So, I didn't separate it that somehow
Right.
Caesar
Right.
wasn't the real deal. I knew he was the real
Right.
deal. I knew
Yeah.
that his faith propelled every aspect of his life. And,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I think, and then, I don't think I really knew much. I encountered some liberation theology at the time, and I think I had mixed feelings about it. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think I encountered Mission Integral yet, but there was
Mm-hmm.
everything is all mixed, right, in our memories. But I
Mm-hmm.
just really do remember feeling like, oh, I know. I went on one of the first InterVarsity plunges.
Uh-huh.
In
Which
fact,
was a kind of an immersion experience.
it was, well, this is what they did. Actually, when I shared this recently, a few years ago, I do a lot of work with InterVarsity, and I shared it with the person who was their national legal counsel, and he just couldn't stop laughing because he was like, liability. Can anybody spell the word liability? Like, didn't occur to anybody at the time. It was about how do you do urban ministry, right? So it was supposed to be to train you and to introduce you to how to do urban ministry. Well, what they did with us was we all showed up. We didn't know what we were going to do for the week. It was a week of break. And they took away the first night, they taught us all about the history of San Francisco and ministry in San Francisco. And then they took away they gave us rags to wear, took away our clothes, took away our wallets. There wasn't such a thing as cell phones, all of our money. And they sent us out with a little rubber band around some index cards, and they would have times and dates. Like it would be, go to this location, go to this intersection and look for something to eat. Go to this intersection and look for a place to sleep. And they would be those kinds of instructions. Wow. And because I grew up in a sort of rough neighborhood of LA, it happened to be that the person I was paired with also had, not of LA, but of another city. So we were much more fine. I mean, some of these kids, Mark, can you imagine? It was really, God really watched over us because, but then the most powerful thing and the thing that was just life-changing, we spent a couple days out in the street. I think it was 2.5 days, all over San Francisco, sleeping and living in the streets, and experiencing different ministries from the perspective of someone who needed them. And then we came back and we debriefed. And then the next day we cleaned up, we got our original clothes back, and we went to all the ministries to ask them what they thought they were doing. And they didn't recognize us. And wow. Even just that they didn't recognize us, right?
Right.
It just formed me for life that I know who we need to be able to really incarnate Jesus and meet Jesus in the places of greatest unjust suffering in our world, that the kind of consciousness that you need to have. So the other thing that was very, very important for me, I actually had a very difficult experience that was absolutely life-shaping. I ended up moving to the only college which had kitchens because I was on a very tight budget. So we wanted to live in a place that had a kitchen. And there wasn't a Christian group at that college. It was a psychology college, which was not my area. I was dance and then moving into sociology. But so we started a Christian group, and I was a young evangelist, and we had 40 new believers in about a month and a half. And the man who was closest, the pastor who was my advisor, was an InterVarsity pastor. And he was Japanese American. And he was really supporting. Like every night we would have worship and we would have Bible studies. And I had organized everybody into cell groups for prayer. I mean, you know how it was. We had homeless people coming and living with us. We were sharing all of our goods. We were trying to be the early church, right?
Right.
And he was so amazing. Like every day he would, teach me, and then I would teach, right? And then he went away as a missionary to Peru, and they sent somebody else from the Body Life Church in Palo Alto to be the pastor, associated with InterVarsity. And he came one night to our celebration, and I think 3 people accepted Christ that night, and he was frowning. And I was like, why is he frowning? And he came up to me afterwards and he said, clearly no one has read Timothy to you, or no one has shown you Timothy. And he said, a woman shall not teach or lead or have authority over a man. You're in sin. So, he took me out of the position. He put 3 boys into the position. And it was a hard time in the life of InterVarsity. Like they couldn't really stand up for me clearly. And I was in just total anguish because I was like, Lord, what am I doing wrong? I'm just trying to follow you. Like, these are my gifts. Like, what's wrong here? So the group split on campus to the conservatives and the liberals. And I didn't fit anywhere.
And conservative and liberal in that context at the time meant what?
Well, it meant a variety of things, but it meant that you had, I remember very clearly that you had to understand that scripture was infallible if you were conservative. And what that meant was that for what I'd read in Timothy, had to be obeyed literally. So you couldn't have women in leadership, or if you did, you had to sort of find these very creative workarounds where they were sort of
Right.
under the covering, right? And they, right.
Yes.
So that's part of what it meant, but it also meant that you believed that people were going to hell who didn't accept Christ. And it meant a whole set of things. It was all connected. It was all woven together. And then the liberals were, universalists essentially. And I remember bouncing back and forth because I just couldn't quite go with either of them. But, and then the Lutheran campus pastor, who was Missouri Synod, but he was part of the sanctuary movement. He was deeply engaged in social justice
So a very conservative form of Lutheranism
combined with finding in the scripture the call to social justice and finding in his way of understanding being Lutheran that he had to live that scripture with all his heart. So he was combining those two things.
Right.
And then he would come. Everybody loved him. Like no one quite knew what to do with him because he didn't fit anywhere. But everybody loved him because he was just this wonderful older man. And we all thought of him as an old man. I'm sure he was much younger than I am now. But we thought of him as this wonderful man. He had this weird customs, like wearing this long white dress when he did worship. But he was just, but he knew all these things from the history of the church that we all thought were so interesting, Anyhow, but what I remember just so clearly was they were having the debate over whether Jesus was the only way. There was all these debates. There was a series of debates. And he was at the debate. And the conservative said, you have to preach the gospel, because if you don't, people are going to hell and their blood is on your hands. And the liberals said, you don't have to preach the gospel because everybody's already saved. It doesn't matter. And so they turned to Herb Schmidt, who was a Lutheran, and said, well, what do you think, Herb? And he said, well, we preach the gospel because Jesus has saved us from sin, death, and the devil. And we are so grateful. And we are so profoundly moved by his grace that we just want to share the goodness of that with everybody that we know. And then what happens to them is God's problem. And I said, him, what he said. That's what I think.
Right.
So, that was like, that was the beginning of becoming Lutheran.
Yes.
Years later, I read Martin Luther and had the exact same feeling, like him, what he believes. That's what I believe.
Right.
But so that was, but he was very, I ended up going to work for him and ended up creating projects with students in town. We created association of homeless people, church members and students in town, where we did emergency services with homeless. And then we created something in the migrant farm worker camps.
Wow.
That was very similar. That was a coalition of church members and students. And I was part of MACHA at the time. So we had like these young MACHA students who were involved with the farm workers and with the local churches. And so he was, this Lutheran pastor was just endlessly supportive of me doing that. So
understandably. Yeah.